So we're talking about Photoshop today. I'm very excited, and we're going to go over the very basic functions of the toolbar and the other little box that I don't know the name for, because I am not an expert. I'm just very experienced. I'm going to start off by opening an existing Photoshop file to show you the different functions, and then I'll take you through like how to create a new file and everything. So this is just an old logo that I designed. So before going through all of the functions over here, which is your main toolbar, we're going to go over to this little guy, this box. And this is all of the layers in this entire file. So we have your background here as your layer, and what you can do to change the background is you could go here. This little box is this circle thing. These are all of the different options to create new layers within your file. So you could create a solid color layer, change it to white, change it to gray, and I'm not going to go through all of these different functions because they're really, like, to get the hang of them, you kind of have to mess around with them on your own on different photos and different files. But just know that those are down there and they're for you to play with. To create a new layer, you just hit this little box thing with the little tab, and you have a new layer, and everything that you create on this layer stays within the layer. So if I just do a brush stroke there and then hide the layer by hitting the little eyeball, it disappears. Or you can delete the layer entirely, or if I create the layer again, do that, and I can erase just this layer without messing up anything else. So that's that. Now we're going to move to the main toolbar. So this is probably my best friend in the entire Photoshop functionality suite. This is just the move tool. You can move anything you want by making sure that the layer you have selected is the thing that you're moving. So in order to get even deeper with this tool, I have the badass layer selected, and you can also select layers by hitting Command and then clicking, which is a little keyboard shortcut. So once you have this selection box around, which you can turn on and off by this little box up here, once you have this selection box around the layer, if you hit the edges of it, this pops up, and with this you can play around with the sizing in order to keep it to scale. But in order to not warp the actual text, you can hit Shift and drag, and it'll stay the same, like not size, but it won't get warped. And then you can also hit Control and then click the layer, and this box pops up, and you can play with the scale, the rotation. You can skew it. For a non-text layer, so I'm actually going to make a new layer and then merge it. So to merge layers, you select both layers by hitting Command, click, and select both. And then for my keyboard shortcut, it's Command E. But for layers, you can just hit Merge Layers. And so now the badass is merged with layer 1, so I'm going to rename it badass, and just so I can easily identify it. I'm going to hit this again, and now all of these other options are up. So the warp option is really funky. You can mess with it a lot, but those are all the different functions within just the move tool, and the further you play around with it, the more stuff you'll be able to do. But that's the move tool. This is one of the many many selection tools. So this selects specific types of shapes, and I'm allowing this to pop up, this menu to pop up over here by just hitting Control-click. And you can see I have my keyboard shortcuts over here, so if I hit M and I'm on the Move tool, then it automatically pops up for me. So the keyboard shortcuts are crucial in Photoshop when you are starting out because it allows your workflow to move much faster and more efficiently. So you can use the rectangle marquee tool to select, if I'm still on the badass layer, if I just want to select like the first half of it, and then I hit V for the move tool, then that cuts off and it is only selecting what I wrapped the rectangle around. You can also do the circle, or there are other single column, single row. I never use those. But yes, that's the first select tool. The second select tool is the lasso tool. And this allows you to be a little bit more specific in your selections. So you can select like single objects and play around with that. And then the other part of the lasso tool is you have these other versions of it. So this one is still exact, but you click in order to control the path, so you can select a wonky shape. The other select tool is the magic wand tool, and this selects, it identifies pixels of similar colors and selects pixels of that color. So for this, if I click on the B, it would only select the B because all those pixels are black. It's kind of weird because it doesn't work on shapes, which I will explain later. But this is super handy for manipulating photos. If you want to actually remove a person in the background from a photo, you could use the magic wand tool to select that person and then like delete it. So there are two options within the magic wand tool. The quick selection tool is much better than the actual magic wand tool, specifically for selecting things in photos, because it's much more intuitive to the object you're trying to select. I would say the default for this function should be the quick selection tool. And then you can see up here, you can select and then you can deselect. That's a little minus sign. So if you have something selected and you go over it with the deselection tool, you can see since all the pixels are black, it's not going to work. But you can like kind of control how you deselect. It's not going to work because it's all black. Let me open a photo. So if I want to select this white sweater, go to the plus sign, and the sweater is almost all selected, but see how I've got kind of the person behind her? So I can go to the deselect tool, and boom, the sweater is selected.
How do you change the size of
You can hit, so the brackets on your keyboard adjust that. So if I'm hitting the close bracket, it makes it bigger. The open bracket makes it smaller. But you can also go up here and adjust the size like this. You can also adjust the hardness. So right now it's at 100%, but if I changed it to 23%, it really is not like super effective. But yeah, I always keep the hardness at 100. And then the spacing is the spacing should be below 25% or below, just so you get a smooth path whenever you're selecting or deselecting something. So, I can close that. So those are your primary selection tools. And then if I want to deselect, I'll just hit Command D, and that erases anything. And my default is to always go back to just the move tool just by hitting V. Crop tool is pretty self-explanatory. a lot of people, when they start out, they don't use proper ratio and sizing for when they crop photos, and that's really important. You want to stick to a set ratio. So like anything that we post on YouTube is always 16 by 9. That's like the size of a horizontal video or thumbnail. You know, Instagram photos, obviously, they're all 1 by 1. Now they're getting vertical. You can post anything. Just keep that in mind whenever you're cropping, is to pick the right ratio. This is the eyedropper, and you can basically just select any color within the image, and you can see this guy changing down here. So if I'm selecting the turquoise, and then I want to use a brush and do things in that same color, then I can do that. This is the spot healing brush tool, which is super awesome for like fixing blemishes and stuff. We don't have to go super in depth with this. Let's say we want to erase Aaron's face. And I would go first to the spot healing tool just to see what it can do. This might look really funky. Yeah, so it just changes. It's a smart tool, which means it's very intuitive to the pixels around it. So anything you select, so this would even be a better example. Let's make it smaller. It's gonna just kind of identify the pixels around it and adjust to that. If I want to delete Aaron's face, then I would just select the lasso. And that's all right. So yeah, so that's primarily used for fixing blemishes, cleaning up the backgrounds of photos that need it, and there are a bunch of other similar functionalities with the spot healing tool in this, but this is the primary thing that you will be using if you use it at all. The brush tool has many functions, but basically you can just brush things onto photos. You can use it very specifically for designing little marks and things to go in logos. So to edit the brush tool over here, this is another little toolbar, and you can adjust the icons that pop up in this toolbar by going to Window, and you can see this is the styles thing. If I want to adjust the spacing and make it much smoother, then I just go to that, and you can see it's a way smoother path than if I spaced it out a lot. And then you can go to scattering, scatter the things all over the place. There are so many functions within the brush tool, but if you are just aware that like once you have this icon selected, or this window open, you have a lot of control of what you can do and what you can make your brush do. Yeah, so that's the brush tool. In that you also have the pencil tool, color replacement tool, the mixer brush tool. I rarely use these bottom two. I don't know. I kind of want to stick to the basics with this, and if you guys are interested in going more in depth, then we can set up a separate talk, but these are like the basic functions. The clone stamp tool is very similar to the spot healing, but the clone stamp tool actually takes, so I'm going to make this way bigger and increase the hardness to 100%. And so the clone stamp tool, you have to hit Option or Alt click, and then wherever you go, whatever you have selected by hitting Alt click, if you increase the opacity, select over here. There, that's what I'm looking for. You can drag that anywhere. So that this is also used for like blemishes and dragging direct like skin tones onto another part of the face. It's like, I don't know, that's primarily what I use it for. Or if you have like a boat in a big photo of the water and you want to get rid of the boat, then you can like take apart the ocean and directly overlay it over the ship, but yeah. So that's that function. Eraser tool is good to use, so if I do a little brush, you can just hit E for eraser, it's the keyboard shortcut, and well, that's not right. Let's create a new layer, E, and it'll erase that specific layer. So it was erasing the background, because you see right here you have the foreground color and the background color, and while this photo is the background, the thing underneath the photo we can set to white or red or anything. So if we erase the photo, then it just replaces it with the background color. This is the gradient tool. I also rarely use this, but basically you draw a line and it gives you whatever these two colors are set up to be within that, and then you can adjust, like, oh, if I want it to be a circle, and I can do that. It's fun. Smudge tool, now we're getting more into manipulating the pixels of different photos. So if I want the focus to be much more on what's going on stage, then I would go over here, just hit Control, click again. You have the blur tool, the sharpen tool, and the smudge tool. So the blur tool, if you make it bigger, obviously like blurs out significantly anything that is going on in the foreground. I would even go up here, just that. It might take a second to process. But that is, and I'll show you, this is the history tool, so you can see I just used the blur brush like 4 times. If I click this, you can see the difference if you look where I used it. So, there's that. Sharpen tool, surprise, surprise, it sharpens things. So, and then the smudge tool I rarely use because it's super powerful and very scary at times. But basically, instead of blurring things, it just smudges things. And then we have this little guy over here, which is the dodge, burn, and sponge tool. So the dodge tool brightens things. So you can select your shadows, midtones, or highlights, and whatever you're trying to brighten. So this right here would be a highlight. I'll go over here, adjust the exposure down to like, I don't know, 25-ish%. And it just increases that. But if I set it to shadows and I go over highlight, it barely does anything at all. But if I go to a shadow and try to brighten it makes a lot of progress. So it's just, again, something to play around with. I use this primarily like if a guest, if I take a photo of Aaron and a podcast guest and their faces are in shadow for some reason, I'll go in and just like hit the dodge tool a couple of times over the entire face, usually set to the mid-tone thing, and it'll usually get the job done. But I try not to set them up in lighting where their faces are in shadow. That's a good rule. The burn tool is used for darkening, so you can see what I'm doing here. And then the sponge tool is kind of fun because it saturates and desaturates things. So desaturate, have it set to strength is 100%. And let's just make Tammy's jacket not fun. And there we go, now she's wearing a gray jacket. And we'll undo all of it. Then the saturate tool, it's obviously the opposite, it makes it much brighter. Now she's wearing neon green. There's that. The pen tool is good for selecting, but it's also very, very tricky and requires just a lot of playing around. So it creates specific paths. So if I want to select this guy, I'm going to do this. should be zoomed all the way in. And you'll get the hang of like using the anchor points and stuff, but it's pretty tricky. I don't use the pen tool much for anything other than creating like unique shapes for logo designs, and I don't do that now that I'm with Piper and not designing logos on my own. So pen tool, you probably won't need it for a whole lot.
Could you separate him from?
So you can. By creating selection and then hitting that. It's just, there's no real reason for it.
And then you could put that on like on top of another photo.
Exactly. If you open, I can even drag this onto this layer, and this guy is now a badass.
Nice.
You can make it bigger. Oh my gosh, such a baller. All right, deselect that. Text tool, pretty self-explanatory. And once you have that done, make it, selected, make it bigger. And then in order to manipulate color and everything, you can either go over to this box, which I always work out of, or you can use the top toolbar. But you can change the color of the text, you can change the size of the text to make it 200. You can change the font, and all of that is just pretty self-explanatory once you start playing around with it. Let's do that. And then this is the path selector, which we created a path with this, the pen tool, and that just allows you to drag the path anywhere you want. And then this is probably the last thing you'll need to know, and this is just the shape tool. So you can create different shapes here. If I go over, hit Control click, circle, and we made a box thing. Yay! Trying that anyway. But in order to create shapes that can like stand alone and be independent, you have to create different layers. So if I do a circle here, I'll make a red square, go over here, rectangle, and you can drag that wherever you want. But yeah, the main thing is to remember to separate your layers when you're first starting out, so you have complete control over every element of your design. And then the other core functions that you need to know are how to go back a step. So I showed you our history over here. And if I say I wanted to send this to a client and I was just messing around with the final look, and then I made this look like that, and that looks really terrible, but I want to erase it. I just hit Alt Command Z, and that deselects. You could also go up here and select like step backward. So get used to having your left hand on your keyboard to deselect and select, and see we are going through our whole history of this whole project. To create a new document, that or file, that would be super helpful. You can just hit Command N or go up here, just hit File New, since this is already open. And then this is where you enter all of the information that you'll need. So if we're creating a YouTube thumbnail, this is a template that I use very often. It's 1920 by 1080, resolution is 300 pixels per inch, or DPI, dots per inch. I'll say thumbnail, make sure the color mode is set to RGB, and this is a YouTube thumbnail. And we'll shrink the text to 20, center it, So see how I hit enter and that jumped down there? The way to fix that, this is set to 85, and if I set it to something like 22, it would be a problem. But usually it's set to auto, and it adjusts on its own. So let's just highlight this, change the text, click and drag, make it bigger, and oh boy, let me drag this image into it. I'm just going to hit Command minus to zoom out of the image, and then I already have the move tool selected, so select that, scale it down, drag it to the middle, zoom back in, move this layer behind the text, and then let's create a solid color overlay over top of the photo, make it light gray, make the opacity 50%. You can see the text is already standing out a lot better, but I want to orient it to the left, up there, and let's create a gradient. So this is my standard process for YouTube thumbnail, by the way. Just like making sure the text stands out appropriately and scaling it down. So by using the scale tool on the gradient, within the gradient, you can make it a lot more fuzzy, or if the scale is at 1, it's obviously a harsher line. Please don't ever scale it at 1, because that looks terrible. So let's keep it around 30-ish, 36. And typically, I won't have all the text on one layer. I will let's delete this, keep that how it is, and we'll change that to something fun and funky. And I still don't like the way this looks, so we'll delete the color overlay. Let's make the photo even bigger so we get more of Aaron and Tammy. And then we'll adjust the gradient, so by double clicking on the box of whatever layer you're on, it opens the functions. Set this to 0, so it's straight on. And I mean, you could get away with this as a thumbnail. It's not a very good thumbnail, but let's delete that. Create a new layer. This is also something that I typically do. Drag that, change this to white. Control click and distort. We'll give us a little angle there, just slightly more stylized. Move that down. Turn that to white. And this is honestly what a lot of our YouTube thumbnails look like at this point in time. So that's how you create a basic YouTube thumbnail. Cool. Any major questions?
How do you make sure you just made that rectangle or whatever shape you want to call it now? How do you make sure the bottom is parallel?
So, excellent question. I'll just hide that and make a new one. So you can drag this go to the move tool again. I just hit V, that's the keyboard shortcut after that. Click that, Control, distort, and then by holding Shift down, you can drag this pretty much wherever and the bottom stays straight. For newer machines, like on the iMacs that we have, if you want to create a new shape, and that's not there at all, but if you want to create a new shape, like just a rectangle, or if I want to create a square, I have to hold shift and it will create a square, whatever size I want it. But by holding shift on the iMacs that we have, it makes it a free transform, so it's reverse. So by not holding shift, I can make any size rectangle I want, but it's really hard to get a perfect square unless I hit shift, and it's the opposite on the computer, if that makes sense. Any other questions?
Can you talk about the gradient tool?
Sure. So I never use this gradient tool. I always create new gradient layers. And you can do that just by going here. And it has a lot of automatic presets for you. So you can click any one of those. And the other, let's actually talk about this. So we will talk about gradients just in the background.
Little boxes.
These little boxes, yeah. So you can drag that and make it, it looks like a sunset, pretty. Or you can delete it entirely, or you can drag it over here. So let's stick with that and pretend that looks good. So if you hit OK, you can change the angle. Let's keep that exactly 90. You can change the style of gradient, so if you want it to be a circle, you can do that. If you want the blue to be on the outside, hit reverse. That looks whack. And there are like a bunch of different functions for that. The scale, like we talked about, if you scale it super large, then it gets bigger, obviously. If you scale it down, it gets smaller. Rocket science. You can align it with a layer. So if you don't align it with a layer, then it'll open up and you have a lot. It'll just it could either be the blue overtakes all of it or like the yellow overtakes all of it. You always want to align it with the layer. But that's basically the gradient tool. So if I want to keep this gradient and give the impression that there is a gradient over the photo, I'm going to change this to white because this is really bothering me, the screen. If I go to overlay, then it creates this effect. If I go to darken, then it takes all the highlights. So if you zoom in here, it leaves all the darkest pixels of the photo or of the layer beneath it, and it takes over the highlights. But if I go to lighten, then it leaves all the lightest pixels of the layer beneath it, and it makes the impression on the dark pixels. You can also go to multiply, which, I don't know, you can play around with all of these different functions to find out what they do. These are whack. Dissolve is not really anything unless you adjust the opacity and then it dissolves. But yeah, that's that basic. You can do this like for any of the layers. So if I want to, let's hide that. If I want to make this kind of look like it's blending into the background, not blending in, but I could either do soft light, and that's like a much softer impression, or overlay, or if I want to give the impression that the text is like going back with the lines of the room, then do skew. This is actually a perspective thing, but skew it down a little bit. Then let's just copy this layer. The other thing, if you want to make any major changes to any layer, always make a copy of the layer just to have. and by doing that, you can just click and drag down to the layer and it creates a copy. And hide the copy so you can see what you're doing. But create a new layer, merge it with the text layer, and then perspective. And it makes it kind of look like it's going down the wall. But, yeah. And then if I want to overlay it for so then it really looks like it's just kind of painted on the wall, which is a fun thing. Yeah. Gradients? Did I answer your questions, kind of?
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Cool. The main thing to keep in mind is while you now know all the functions of these different tools, it's really easy to get carried away and do too much to a design when you first start out. Like, oh my gosh, I have all this knowledge, I can make things skewed and warped and crazy shapes, and really, like, you just want to kind of keep designs simple. There's a really good example of this that I just saw on Pinterest when I was looking for examples of what I'm talking about. Typography. This. Bad typography is everywhere. Good typography is invisible. And that's like a really good design. But it's so, so true. You really want the content of your image, or you want to have a core idea of what you have to get across with the graphic that you're designing. And by putting too many like bells and whistles in it, it can just take away from the overall quality. So if I kept that on there and made that, I don't know. And then, oh my gosh, what if I added a fun star with the shape tool? Because that's possible. You can do a custom shape. And there's arrows? What? Let's do an arrow! But not. Yeah, that just looks terrible. So keep it simple. Anyway, any other questions? No? Cool. Thanks for your time, guys.
Thank you.
And the fun thing about Photoshop is you think of the phrase, there's more than one way to skin a cat. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of ways to perform one simple action. So identifying what you work best with and what you can make most efficient for yourself in your own process is going to be fun.